I'm going to welcome everyone here and we'll get started. Um, this is part of our National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center webinar series. I'm Kate Trams, and today we have Sean Bear and Ray Daw here to speak on Native American and Alaska Native veterans, keys to understanding challenges and strengths of American Indian and Alaska Native clients who suffer from PTSD. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We are part of the MHTTC network, which also includes 10 regional centers, a network coordinating office, and the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. This project is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. In the next couple of days, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended, which includes a link to the recording, handouts of the slides, and a CEU request form. Our center is an ADEX certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEUs for a $15 fee. And I just want to acknowledge that the NADEC may not be necessarily applicable to all mental health professionals, but we're working on adding some CEU options that might be appropriate for you as well. So we would love to hear your feedback on where you might prefer to get CEUs, if that would be helpful. Immediately following today's webinar, you will be redirected to our GIPR evaluation. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and asks about your satisfaction with the event. The feedback is critical to our future work, and we greatly value your opinion and appreciate your time in sharing your thoughts with us. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please use the chat pod to share your questions and comments, and we will address your questions at appropriate points during the presentation. So I want to welcome Ray Daw. Ray is Navajo, originally from Houck, Arizona, and he has been working in the behavioral health field for about 35 years in the Navajo Nation, nonprofits, and most recently in Alaska. Ray has been a consultant and friend of ours for many years now, and he is a veteran, and I am so excited that he's here to present on this topic, and I want to welcome Ray. And then we also have Sean Bear, who is the co-director of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center for the Native American and Alaska Native Center here at the University of Iowa. And he has been working in mental health counseling and substance abuse counseling for many years. And he is a member of the Meskwaki tribe here in Tama, Iowa, and he's also a veteran. And so I'm so excited to have them both to share from their experience and to talk about how we can best help our veterans. So I want to thank you, Sean and Ray, and I'll pass things over to you at this time.
Okay, hello all. This is Sean. So in the beginning here, I wanted to talk a little bit how we started out with this project. And we began this project as a means of assisting those working with Native veterans to better understanding the unique challenges that are comprised while assisting with trauma and PTSD. Remembering that the Native veterans are a different culture and their belief systems can be very different. So with looking at the overall presentation, you'll see that there's 5 modules to this curriculum. Normally this would take about 3 days to be able to get through, so we're kind of compressed it down in this hour. So beginning the first part was historical overview of natives in warfare, trauma, historical trauma, approaches to assessment and treatment, traditional beliefs and healing practices, and of course healing the healer. We wanted to make sure that those assisting veterans and people with PTSD or trauma could help themselves as well. So if you see here, you have the Native Veteran Curriculum. This is actually the kind of the second name that we began with, but we kind of had discussions for a while. We added on Healing the Returning Warrior. And in this, we want to make sure that everybody knows that a warrior is not just males, but also women. We don't want to kind of separate the two and say this or that. So we want to be kind of neutral in that manner. Also, that we want to make sure that while we are doing this whole curriculum and trainings and stuff like that, there are so many different tribes and belief systems out there that it's very hard to be able to get this comprised of all tribes. So when we do this, we do kind of adapt this to wherever we go, but our goal then is to bring a sense of pride to the veterans, as well as to help those family members, the veterans themselves, loved ones, professionals who are helping them. So the overview takes let me see. This here takes an overview, takes a look at, the historical overview takes a look at what is known within history, yet also the knowledge that have been kept for centuries within Native traditional knowledge. History of Native warfare that goes back much further in the past than when the colonies actually became America. And a lot of times that's what they're talking about when they're saying Native veterans, Native Americans have assisted in war with America for like about approximately 200 years. It's actually much longer than that. They use that number by when it actually became America. Okay, so guerrilla warfare. This was, can look at that as little war. Of course, Native warriors had used many of the fighting tactics that are used today by elite units within the military. This caused much fear of being attacked at any time, which plays it causes a lot of fear being attacked by any time, which plays a toll on soldiers, even today. Before this, many of the soldiers before had used what they call a thin red line. And when they began to fight the natives and stuff like that, they realized that many of these natives fought very differently. They thought that the natives were actually kind of scared and kind of weak and couldn't fight, but really in the end what they found out was that the native fighting tactics used by the tribes were much superior to the combat tactics used by early on. There was even different things where we talk about where the natives, while they were attacking, sometimes they'd use snipers and things like that, ambushes. And a lot of times what happened was it causes so much fear within the soldiers that they get tired. It's hard for them to be able to concentrate. So, and that's something that can really help in the military anyway, so that they tire the soldiers out in a sense. I know that within the military, I had gone through a sleep deprivation course. It was for a whole week. The whole time I got 4 hours of sleep, but it really played a toll on us. And eventually they told us why we went through that. But also in beginning this curriculum, my time within Fort Bragg, I was working in a Special Forces headquarters. And while I was there, I was able to read all these different books and many things on the walls. And they gave a lot of credit to the Native Americans who taught many of the fighting tactics. That's where they believe that they came from, or that their history comes from. And a lot of times, even much earlier on, the natives had trained other people, so that then they began groups, the colonists, and they became the rangers. Later on, in military, then they became scouts, and but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so here talk about what I was talking about, where they became scouts. It was called the Indian Scouting Service. So natives were utilized very early on, yet also fought alongside the colonists. In each treaty, it was written that the native tribes were required to help patrol and protect the borders and defend them. It became a common practice when writing treaties with the native tribes. There's also an account in military history. These officers and soldiers spoke of one native who was fighting alongside them, the colonists. They gave such an account by different people, and said they had seen this native fighting on one side of the battlefield when he was actually on the other side. They said it happened in different combat areas, different wars or different fights they had, but the report admitted then that natives had very powerful medicine. You know, today it's kind of hard to believe when some of our beliefs and things are misunderstood or considered myth, folklore, or looking at mental health. Sometimes they look at that as a mental health disorder or issues. Natives were later placed in what is called the Indian Scouting Service, whose history became legendary in forming what is now known the U.S. Army Special Forces. So here in 1917, you'll see where many soldiers had entered the military. Many natives who joined the military were often given the most dangerous positions and duties, as then all natives were regarded as having spiritual senses that enabled them to do what others could not. These became what is called the chiefs. Many of these beliefs are still held today of natives who joined the military. When I first got into Fort Bragg, we had gone to our unit, and this leader of the squad I had gone to then, he had been one of the top, sergeants at that time, I guess, and he'd also been the pre-ranger instructor during that time. And right away he said, "Are you one of our Indians here?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Well, you're on my side, and you're on my team, so come on." So right away it went from that. I had no idea what I was getting into, because that squad was very active, did a lot of things. A lot of times we were even in front of the scout platoon. Okay, so here we talk a little bit about the code talkers. After World War I, the Choctaw became the first code talkers of the military. Later on, many other tribal code talkers would be used from various tribes. During this time, it's kind of interesting. Hitler did not want to have to fight against this, so he inserted people to speak to the tribes and get them not to join the military. He did not want to have to try to break those codes because they hadn't been done before. He later used a symbol of the 45th Infantry, who utilized the swastika, cross lightning bolts. He turned it backwards. He thought that would help, so the natives would not fight against him. So they'd seen later it didn't have the effect that Hitler thought, and it angered the natives so much that so many more joined the fight against him. Okay, so we begin with Module 2, Ray.
Right. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I think Sean gave a very good overview of history of native warfare and modern day American Indian soldier. And we understand in the native culture, native history that our people have had centuries of experience with pretty heavy conflict with across the country, and many of you that are attending the webinar are aware that there's a good amount of work occurring today in contemporary psychology, behavioral health around better appreciating the effect trauma has on all people, particularly people of color. And with Native veterans in particular, we're looking at Native life experiences that do show up in Native lives. And so in the second module, we begin to explore and have a discussion with participants around how to understand trauma individually, collectively in the community, collectively as Native veterans, and collectively with allies or providers that come and work with us, Native veterans, and come to work with us in our communities. So we begin with a discussion on how we define trauma. There are a number of different ways of defining trauma. And in this particular section, we would begin to have a discussion on cultural trauma, how that disrupts severely lives of people in a community or family system. We also have some discussion about historical trauma. Dr. Maria Braveheart out of University of New Mexico, she's Lakota, has done really great work in the last over 30 years now around introducing historical trauma and creating a model from which we can understand the impact of colonization upon tribal communities and tribal societies. The third item we look at is in defining trauma as intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is a topic developed by Eduardo Duran about the same time that the historical trauma model came out. And there's a lot of similarities across the three, cultural trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. But the good thing about these three approaches is that they help us develop ways of understanding where we are individually, where our families and communities are related to our experiences with trauma, either together or individually. Because that brings up our experiences with present trauma. And every human being has vulnerability to trauma. And Native people in particular have experienced trauma on a daily basis in a number of different forms and fashions, and that's a teaching that Deep Bigfoot has out of Oklahoma that's been really good to experience and have discussions around. So this is how we begin defining trauma. And there are other, like I said, there are other ways of defining trauma. In the work that we would do in tribal communities with this module, we would have a discussion with participants on how they define trauma, and the list would get expanded from that, and definitions would get developed from those discussions. And that's our approach with this particular part of the presentation. Of course, historical trauma has been broadly acknowledged, I think, and accepted across Native country as a significant way of understanding tribal experiences and locally and Native experiences across the country and internationally. And what we would do here is have a fairly strong discussion about historical trauma and how those symptoms derive from losses in which our ancestors experience and how they're passed on over time, and how those traumatic life experiences get compounded. And they do create physical, emotional, and psychological hardships and undue change. Undue change socially, culturally, physically with each individual that experiences a trauma. That's how those changes get expressed. And they change our environment, and they change our laws, oftentimes, but within the tribe and nationally. And because there's historical trauma that's continually experienced, and it does get compounded, and many folks have difficulty being able to mourn or pray in the manner that they've generally used to. And you see the definition of historical trauma on this slide, which is the legacy of chronic trauma and unresolved grief across generations. And the definition developed by Braveheart and De Bruin back in 1998 in one of the articles that they published. The historical trauma model in particular, sometimes is misunderstood, and Dr. Braveheart and I generally have discussions about the misunderstanding of historical trauma. The misunderstanding of historical trauma basically is the impression that the historical trauma model is about trauma only. But the model is really about a pathway to healing. And the pathway to healing within the historical trauma model looks like this. There are 4 components to historical trauma and unresolved grief. The first part of the historical trauma model is around confronting historical trauma and embracing the history. Talking about those things that have happened to tribes, within tribes, tribal communities, and Native families that have been traumatic in our history. And then the second part of the historical trauma model is the part where we begin to understand the impact of that trauma. What has that trauma over time created and caused and made within tribal communities and families and with us individually? How has that affected us individually? Once we begin to understand the impact of that trauma, then we begin the process within the third component of the historical trauma model, which is to begin to release the pain. No human being enjoys or can endure consistent pain or chronic pain without having that pain having really adverse effects. So within the historical trauma model, there's a very conscious discussion about how we can begin to release our pain. And that releasing of pain goes to understanding our cultural ways, whether we're assimilated or whether we're traditional, and beginning to understand our spiritual ways that come from that, and then the legacy of resilience that comes with us also. It's important to acknowledge that we have a history of trauma. We also have a really strong history of resilience within tribal communities that we can learn from and live by. And those are the teachings within the third component of the historical trauma model that oftentimes doesn't get expressed or taught in discussions and presentations around historical trauma. Finally, the fourth component of the historical trauma model is about transcending that trauma. When we've done our work at releasing the pain, we begin a process of healing, in the process of living our life in a more positive and way, and then the fourth component of how do we continue living that way so that we become good human beings and good people to each other, and our families and our relatives, and to our native people, and also to our non-native people. When we transcend the pain, and we're able to live harmoniously, and in the Navajo way, we say in the Piri way. And so that's the fourth component of the historical trauma model that's important to have discussion around and relate to. We recognize there's research that validates that natives have high rates of PTSD, native veterans in particular. And there's a high prevalence of PTSD when compared to white veterans. And some of us believe that is due to our historical trauma, but also due to our adverse childhood experiences. Many Native men and women come through a childhood of adverse experiences that really affect us later on. And joining the military and encountering the kind of violence and that exists from being a veteran, being in the military, can compound upon the adverse childhood experiences. And I believe that is a significant factor in how Native veterans have a higher prevalence of PTSD than compared to non-Native veterans. So we'll hand this back off to Sean as he gets into the third module. Thank you.
Okay, so the Native American Curriculum Healing and Returning Warrior, Module 3. So this takes approaches to assessment and treatment. Uses a lot of what is being used today for assessment and treatment of veterans. Yet also, we do discuss some considerations when working with the Native American veteran population. So first, what we really like to do is to look at the cultural identity in which the individual reports, because that's very important, as not all natives or their descendants are the same. Depending upon their level of assimilation, they may not have the knowledge, understanding, or beliefs as previous generations have. They may not want a different treatment than what is being used today. Yet there are those who prefer traditional practices and approaches within their treatment. The sweat has been utilized, which is shown to be beneficial. Being around other Native veterans was very important. Those who were more traditional had tended to want more of the sweats or ceremonies, have medicine people visit, utilizing some of the cultural manner of healing. Those who were more assimilated did not want those. They wanted to be treated like anyone else. So that's something very important. And also to look at different tribes, because different tribes are going to be very different as well. You can't just kind of lump them up into one sum and saying all these are the same. It's not going to work that way. Okay, so we look at a little bit into tribal, cultural, and spiritual assessments. So looking at the level of assimilation or traditional practice or beliefs, it kind of goes along the spectrum of whether somebody is more traditional or more assimilated. Of course, there's those that are bicultural. Okay, it could be anywhere in between. But some of these might look at more of kind of basic things, maybe surrounded by the powwow, or while some go beyond into ceremonial practices and beliefs. We need to look at their self-esteem and self-identity, because even if they are within a tribe, they might identify as different than the tribe does. And how their self-esteem also is important, because within their community, if they feel left out or outside, of course, their self-esteem may be a little low. So look at treatment of PTSD. Evidence-based, yet those considered experience-based should be recognized or be utilized with tribes. Many native practices and beliefs have been held for thousands of years of evidence that it works, yet these are not scientifically proven, like in a laboratory environment like that. So, but the native practices have been utilized a long time. There are many different approaches that are evidence-based to many veterans as well. So we look at the treatment approach. We need to look at each individual as an individual. We need to remember there are so many different tribes, languages, beliefs, and practices that are not always the same in each tribe. This is the reason why some may feel culturally competent with one tribe, yet they may know very little about another tribe. It can be that extreme. So we look at family education and support. Healing needs to be with the whole family. As one illness or spiritual malady, however you see it, might affect the whole family. Also comes a stress and change of residences for a child or family going from one area to the next. You're having to make new friends all over again. You're always a new kid, or you're always a new spouse in one area. But remember, even within the military, spouses have a big support system. They have those systems within the military that they can utilize, that usually all the spouses of the military soldier can utilize, and they support one another. But once they get out, they're kind of thrown into like a society in a sense that can feel very different. I know when I got out of the military, it was like a whole new world out there. Everything seemed chaotic, and it was hard to function for me for a little while. So. No order, I guess you should say. So looking at peer support. Veterans helping veterans. It helps to really remember and utilize that camaraderie, teamwork, such as in the military, and learn that they are not alone, to realize that once again. Even the uses of other branches of service or other eras of combat, as long as it's another veteran. That's something that has been understood for a while now. We look at tribes as a resource and partner in care. Now we need to remember that and utilize the tribes in the surrounding areas, but also within the community that each individual comes from, because this needs to look at their cultural beliefs and practices to make sure using the correct culture and community, remembering that not all are the same. Medicine people is to assist in mental health assessment to make sure that the diagnosis is not a cultural thing. They may also be utilized by individuals in their healings. These medicine people are healers to be able to help those soldiers. There are many different practices that can be very different from one tribe to the next. So then we get into Module 4. Right.
Okay. Within this module, we would be putting in a good amount of time discussing tribal, local approaches to traditional healing and traditional modalities and traditional teachings. I see in this webinar we have people from Montana, California, Connecticut in this webinar. So as you hear this discussion from Sean and I would ask you to think about how the material the content that you're seeing and the presentation we're doing relates back to your tribe and your community. For example, in traditional healing, how would that look like with a Carrick tribe in California or Lakota people in South Dakota? There are cultural implications, of course, when working with natives, and there are that are important to acknowledge. We would have discussion around traditional versus non-traditional beliefs, and how those would be expressed or would be conducted within the tribal community. What you're getting in this real quick presentation, this introductory presentation, is how we would engage in really detailed discussion with tribal people or tribal veterans that are attending a 2-day or 3-day workshop with us. We would have a discussion around traditional medicine, tribal medicine, and Euro-American medication. How do they work for different people in the tribe and with different veterans that are experiencing adjustment or re-assimilation back into tribal communities. We would have a discussion around how those traditional and modern ways are complement each other and sometimes go together. We would have that discussion around medication, which is how your American or white man way of taking care of symptoms exists. And finally, we would have a discussion around the ways of life that exist among us, our spiritual ways and our medicine ways. For my people, Navajo, for example, we have herbs and tobacco that are applied, and spiritual ways that are used by our healers when the veteran begins to re-assimilate back into communities. Those are the kind of discussions that we would have within different tribal communities when we take these modules to another tribal context. I read that the Healing Lodge, the NIPI or Tache, as we call it in Navajo, is having a broader application among organizations that do healing work with veterans, and have shown to be very good at helping veterans begin to heal from their PTSD experiences in particular. And there are other ways, of course, that that can be brought into the tribal context as a way to begin purifying veterans from their adverse experiences. Native tribes, warriors or combat veterans are often seen as having their spirits affected by killing of an enemy. That's certainly true for Navajo. We have healing ceremonies in Navajo for veterans or people who have experienced death or themselves going through a death experience as being in combat or things like that. And so we have ways like that to help our Navajo veterans return back to the communities. And so we have protective way ceremonies that we apply. So these are the kind of discussions we're engaged in with tribal communities, whether they come from Washoe or Fort Belknap. Then we go to the final module, which is the Module 5. So in closing, before going into Module 5, among the other ways that tribes historically have begun preparing young men and young women wasn't at later life. That preparation for being a caretaker, a healer, a warrior began early on in age. With Navajo people, for example, young men, young women are given, are named early on to prepare them for their life journey. And so those are some of the cultural experiences that exist traditionally among Native people, and I'm using the Navajo experience as an example. But we'll go on to Module 5 now, and Sean will use this. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Native Veteran Curriculum Healing the Returning Warrior Module 5 has to do with healing the healer, which addresses secondary trauma, often referred to as vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. In this module uses more of a storytelling approach to addressing compassion fatigue using traditional knowledge. So part of this talks about learning from the old. It's remembering that everything kind of works in a circle, that we need to look at ourselves not just part of creation, but actually connected through it, with it. So teaching about the circle of life, and there's many different ways of looking at this. So we get into this. So remembering that many of the times when therapists are helping each other, it can look very much like when a medicine person is healing an individual. A connection is made, but we need to remember that this also needs to be severed after the counseling session or a healing is done. Because if not, then you ended up carrying this other person's sickness or issues with you, in a sense. And a lot of times that comes as energy, because in a sense, if we look at all the world and everything within us, we know that everything is energy. But also, it's not just energy that we have or what's in the walls or in everything else. It's also in each thought, feeling, behavior, action, everything that's going on around us. So counselors and therapists, they need to look at this kind of very similarly. And I think a lot of the natives could understand this a little bit, because after each session, to be able to remember to kind of step away from that. Some might, in a sense, with their mind, kind of concentrate on everybody's bubble, in a sense, separating again. Because when a person is in therapy, or when a healer is healing somebody, we have to look at it like we have an aura or a bubble around us, a bubble of energy, our own energies. Well, when we connect to another person and we'll do that, it becomes one. But sometimes the energies of each person can kind of mix. So then when we walk away, we might be carrying part of somebody else's kind of problems in the form of energy. But we also need to be able to cleanse those. And the last time, we might use that with sage or cedar, different kind of sweat lodge or whatever it might be. So stress, we need to remember, it takes a toll on the body. It comes from our environment, but also from others. Close proximity to many others' energies, especially when someone is already susceptible, may make healing more difficult. Remembering that there's energy within these thoughts, feelings, emotions, but also remember that those too may affect other people around us. It's kind of like when you have, let's say, when one apple ruins a whole bunch, because you might have a child come into a room, maybe they're not real rowdy right away, but then that starts to affect other children. That's kind of been looked at like that. So we look at a little bit with the follow-up on this. And the American Indian Alaska Native, ATC, can do introductory presentations with tribal leaders and providers on the veteran wellness curriculum. We can adapt the veterans curriculum to tribally specific or with tribal leaders, providers, and tribal veterans. We can provide trainings with tribal co-trainers that can be 2 to 5 days. We can also do a trainer of trainers, develop other trainers. One of the main things we wanted to be able to do with this is to be able to take this training out to other tribes and let us speak about how a lot of these things come into play. And then what we would like then, if you would like, you can take the curriculum after the training. If you want to design this for your tribe using your own culture and beliefs, you may do that. That's part of ours, like giving back. So is there any questions? We wanted to leave more room at the end for questions because normally we get a lot of questions when we're presenting.
Sean, there was a clarification question earlier. From the page, I might just try to pull this up here a second. That had yes, this HTUG. We wanted to just clarify what HTUG stands for.
This is great, HTUG is an abbreviation of historical trauma and unresolved grief. That's a topic within the historical trauma framework that Maria Braveheart designed. This goes back to the idea that where there's chronic trauma, there's also grief that is unresolved. And going through those 4 components that are shown on the screen is a pathway towards healing from the historical trauma and healing from the unresolved grief. Okay? Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments?
I see that George has a question. How does the wellness curriculum support building or reconnecting to the community? That's a really good question, George. And as Sean described earlier, what we want to do with the Veterans Wellness Model is take the modules and the training to local tribes and have discussions with local tribal veterans around the 5 modules that we went through this afternoon. And by doing so with veterans, when they talk about local tribal histories with conflict and warfare, and talk about local tribal histories with trauma experiences, and when we have discussions with local veterans about their experiences within your American healing systems and about spiritual traditional practices that are there, and then talk about how we heal healers, local veterans. And that's how we believe we begin to have veterans reconnect to the community. It is very common with us who have spent time in the military to disconnect from the community and isolate ourselves and struggle with reconnecting with families and civilian life. And so our aim is to have these modules work through locally with tribal veterans so that we can begin to have some reintegration occur within the communities, and then have community providers, family members be able to understand the veteran experiences in their local dialogues so they can begin to build support for veterans and help them, veterans at least, deal with trauma that they come back to communities with. Ellen Good has a question, Sean, that about whether we're familiar with the book War and the Soul. Maybe someone who's in the audience knows about that book by Ed Tick. So certainly a good reference for reading. Thank you, Ellen.
Susan also asked if this training would translate to AI women who have experienced intimate partner violence.
Very likely good. Go ahead, Sean.
Go ahead. Go
ahead, Sean.
Later on in the with the whole module, we do discuss part of that. It's because sometimes what happens is when a soldier comes back, it does become into kind of abuse. Not always just physical abuse, but emotional abuse, psychological abuse. It can be neglect, things like that. A lot of these, because if you look at that, the family is also kind of also going through a trauma. It could also seem more like a secondary trauma because it's passed through. And what Ray was talking about before, like how you carry, in a sense, the spirit or spirits with you from combat. Also, some of those kind of things can be, in a sense, transferred to the family. That's why the whole family needs to be healed from this. Usually when you do a healing, you want the whole family, household, things like that to be healed. Hope that answered your question. Unless Ray wants to go on from there.
I think you did a good job answering that question, yeah. That's a topic we've addressed in Module 5.
I know there's one by Sheila Hurd. It's about moral injury.
Mm-hmm.
That is something we've discussed on here as well. Well, in the whole curriculum. It's because a lot of times going into like battle or anything like that kind of goes against some of our beliefs or the way that we grew up. And this may also kind of be what she's talking about with kind of this war within the soul in a sense. But I do know that one thing I have been told is that the way that people believe, in a sense, different religions or belief systems can be very different. I mean, those who say it's okay for war, then it's okay for them. But also, I do know that when I was in the military, there was this person, he was going to be a priest one day. I said, "What are you doing here?" He goes, "You're in a combat unit, right?" He's like, "Well, yeah." He's like, "Back home, I was talking to the priest there, and I told him I wanted to go into a combat unit because I wanted to go through combat so I can help those who've been through there." And I said, "Well, what about your religion? What's it say?" He goes, "I'm okay with that because within our belief systems," he said, is that it says that the soldiers, in a sense, are not responsible for the deaths. It is the governments that are in charge of them, that falls upon them." And I was really surprised by that. Any other questions, feedback? There might be more. Let me see.
Well, I see that some guy named Steve Stein has asked a question about, sorry, Steve. I'm looking for that question that Steve had.
I know there's one with healing practices.
Yeah.
One of those is the sweat example. One thing that they've realized that really helps veterans is to tell their story over and over again. The more they are able to tell their story, and more often they're able to tell their story, the emotional component of the story is kind of separated. So it becomes more of a story than having that emotional connection of it. But also there are such things, with utilizing the sage, the sweetgrass, the prayer. Um, what really we talk within the curriculum is part of something I had to learn before was actually meditation. This medicine man told me, you need to learn to meditate. That's what the spirits are telling me. I was like, meditate? It's like, that's not part of our practice, is it? Yeah, it is. It's just that we have forgotten that. It's kind of the way when people would go on the hill to fast. In a sense, that is part of um, the meditation. Also connecting to Mother Earth, connecting to um, nature and all of creation. We have to be kind of cognizant of that so that they too can help us even better. Because there are different plants or different even trees, Mother Earth, stones, all these different things that can help us. But we need to be able to learn when to go to it, where to go to it, how to do it. But there are ceremonies to be able to go through that to help. Any other questions, or unless
Yeah,
I'm not seeing?
Bonita Bell asked, what is the difference between NATTC and ATTC?
I think that was just written as more of a note form. I think with the National American Indian Alaska Native ATTC, but we also have the TTC now because we also utilize mental health prevention and with the TOR with the or opioid response. So tribal opioid response TOR.
Okay. George also asked a question on ways to address those who have acculturated and aren't interested in the tribal of origin. George, well, we acknowledge that a good portion of our people are assimilated, and within the assimilation lifestyle, there are also spiritual practices that are there that are Judeo-Christian, and there's quite a bit of overlap I see between traditional Judeo-Christian spirituality and Native spirituality, and I think this will open up a rich discussion on that. Carol Kaufman asks whether we work with VA using this curriculum. This is we're presenting this curriculum out in the general audience right now. We've had some contact with veterans representatives from the VA about possibly taking the curriculum into some sectors of the VA. So that's in the beginning stages of dialogue right now, I believe, and I think will be an area that we will see developing further on in the coming months. Other questions? Yeah. Ellen Good provides us a link, elderwarrior.com. Thank you, Ellen, for that referral. I'll definitely look at that. Sheila Hurd asks thoughts about mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a process that is being taught pretty heavily in many sectors within Native country, and I think traditionally, very traditional practices around attending and traditional practices really relate to that. It is teachings in many tribes to be aware and to attend to surroundings and to be alert and to reflect on what we experience daily. And those are very traditional teachings, and mindfulness meditation, I think, relates to that. Thank you.
I know there was a question about family. I won't go to any certain kind of family therapy. But, I do believe that education should be utilized within the whole family so that they know what the veteran is going through, what they're going through. Because sometimes we learn that things are normal, not as odd as we might, had previously thought.
Info and longer trainings by Ellen Good. Through this, you have primarily Sean's information, and we would like to have discussion with Sean on that. We're in discussions with a number of tribes about incorporating these trainings to different tribal communities, so we're very interested in doing that. Go ahead. Aryan medicine asks, would ACEs benefit Native Americans? One of the things I appreciate about the ACEs model is I see it as a catching up on what we have been talking about through intergenerational trauma and historical trauma for quite a few years. And the ACEs model, of course, comes from a Kaiser Permanente study in California. So I see it as a catching up to what we've been talking about for quite a while, and that's how I appreciate the ACEs dialogue. It complements, I think, what we've been talking about for quite a while in Native country.
Well, I know that we are talking about making some kind of flyer with more description on this curriculum, so that others will know exactly what it's consisted of, and maybe different the length of time they might want.
Okay, does anybody have any further questions? We can wrap this up. We're at time limit now. Sean and Ray, thanks so much for doing this today. And just so you guys know, we will be featuring these modules each month on the second Wednesday of the month until April. So tune in again to hear more in-depth information from these two, and we really appreciate your time today, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.